Don't come home, Zana. Your sister doesn't want drama. My mother's voice was a guillotine, severing 27 years of belonging in a single cold breath. I was being sacrificed for a lie, erased so Eris could play the fragile saint in a home where my only crime was existing. The air in Greenwich, Connecticut, didn't just feel cold that Thanksgiving. It felt sharp, like a razor blade pressing against my skin. I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in, a place of cedar shingles and meticulously manicured lawns that now seemed like a fortress designed to keep me out. In my arms, I held a gift basket wrapped in gold foil and dark silk ribbons, a collection of fine wines and artisanal chocolates I'd spent a week selecting. It wasn't an olive branch exactly. It was more like a bridge I was trying to build back to a shore that was slowly eroding into the sea. I've always believed that love isn't a transaction, yet here I was, 32 years old, still trying to use the currency of a perfect gift to buy a moment of belonging. Through the heavy oak door, the muffled sounds of my family drifted out into the gray afternoon. I could hear the rhythmic clink of silver against china, the sound of a life that was continuing quite comfortably without my presence. It's a strange thing, standing on a threshold and realizing you are a ghost in your own story. I looked at the wreath on the door, the same one my mother puts out every year, and remembered my father's favorite armchair just inside the foyer. For a fleeting second, I allowed myself to hope he would be the one to open the door, his eyes crinkling in that way they used to before the silence became our primary language. I took a deep breath, straightened the lapels of my wool coat, and reached for the brass handle. I wasn't going to knock like a stranger. I belonged here. Or at least, I told myself I did. My hand was inches from the wood when the phone in my pocket vibrated against my hip. The screen flashed with a name that usually made my stomach tighten into a knot. Mom. I hesitated, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face, before sliding the bar to answer. Mom, I'm actually right outside. I was just about to... Don't come in, Zana. Myra's voice was as flat as the pavement, devoid of any festive warmth. I froze. The world seemed to go silent, the distant hum of traffic on the turnpike fading into a dull roar in my ears. What? Mom, I drove 3 hours. I have the... Listen to me, she interrupted, her tone sharpening with that practiced edge of maternal authority. Eris is having a very difficult time with this second pregnancy. Her blood pressure is through the roof, and the doctor was very clear about avoiding stressors. She told me this morning that your presence is a trigger for her. She says you always bring this heavy cloud with you. This drama. Drama. The word felt like a slap. I looked at the gift basket, the weight of it suddenly pulling at my shoulders. Drama, Mom? I haven't spoken to Eris in 6 months. The last thing I said to her was a question about why my grandmother's trust fund for my master's degree was suddenly empty. Is asking for my own future drama now? See, that's exactly what I was saying, Myra hissed, her voice low and full of worry. You always take everything so personally. Eris is carrying a miracle, a new life. We can't risk tragedy just because you want to argue about old things at the dinner table. Go home. Stay in Chicago. We'll call you after the holidays. In the background, behind Myra's cold rejection, I heard a peal of laughter. It was Eris. She wasn't resting in a darkened room. She was sharing a joke, her voice bright and vibrant. She sounded perfectly healthy. She sounded like a woman who had successfully campaigned to have her only sister erased from the guest list. My knuckles whitened around the phone as the realization settled into my marrow. I wasn't being asked to leave. I was being deleted to make the room more comfortable for the person who had already stolen my seat. Protecting your peace shouldn't require erasing your daughter, Mom, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I'm not a drama. I'm just a witness to things you'd rather forget. But I suppose it's easier to cast me as the villain than to look in the mirror. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I waited for a defense, a softened word, or even a lie that felt more like love. It never came. The line simply went dead, leaving me with the dial tone and the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves. I looked down at the welcome mat beneath my feet. I didn't knock. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the wine bottles against the door. Instead, I knelt and placed the $500 basket carefully on the mat. ensuring the ribbons were straight. It was an act of dignity, a refusal to become the unstable daughter they wanted me to be. I stood up and glanced through the small side window of the dining room. My father, Lyle, was sitting at the head of the table. He looked older, his shoulders slumped, but as he lifted his wine glass, his eyes flickered toward the window. We locked eyes for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat of recognition. Then he looked away. He turned back to the turkey, back to the laughter, back to the safe, suffocating silence of his own making. Watching him, I felt a strange, cold pity. Some people are so terrified of the storm that they let their own children drown just to keep their feet dry. If you have to shrink your soul just to fit into someone's living room, that room is far too small for you. I turned my back on the house and walked down the driveway, my heels clicking rhythmically on the asphalt. A sound of departure, not of defeat. Have you ever stood in a place that used to be home and realized you no longer recognize the people inside? We spend so much of our lives waiting for an apology that will never come, hoping that if we just act right enough, they will finally see us. But the truth is, you can't be seen by people who have already decided to look the other way. I got into the car and sat in the darkness for a while, the heater struggling against the Connecticut chill. My world wasn't falling apart. It was just becoming more real. The cage I'd lived in, the cage made up of maybe next year and just be quiet for once, was finally opening. I started the engine, the GPS lights illuminating the cabin with a cold blue glow. I had no specific destination, just anywhere except here. As I pulled over, a notification popped up on the dashboard, a message from an unknown number. The man waiting on the other end was about to invite me to the seat I'd been turned away from at my own father's dinner table. I drove into the thick snow, leaving Zana Thatcher behind and wondering who the woman in the rearview mirror would become. The snow didn't just fall. It swirled in aggressive, blinding sheets that seemed intent on erasing the highway from existence. I drove with white-knuckled intensity, my headlights barely cutting through the white void, until a flickering neon sign hummed through the frost like a dying heartbeat. It was a roadside diner, the kind of place that time and the interstate system had collectively decided to forget. I pulled the car into the gravel lot, the engine cutting out with a weary shudder that matched my own. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal, staring at the blurred red letters of the open sign. I was Zana Thatcher, a woman who had spent 32 years trying to build a fortress of belonging, only to watch the gates slammed shut by the people who had supplied the stones. Inside, the diner smelled of burnt coffee, stale tobacco, and the heavy, lingering scent of deep fryer grease. It was a greasy spoon institution, dimly lit and filled with the kind of stale warmth that felt more like a burden than a comfort. I chose a corner booth, sliding onto the cracked vinyl seat that groaned under my weight. I was wearing a charcoal wool coat and Italian leather boots, expensive, polished things that felt like a costume in this world of flannel shirts and mud-caked work boots. I felt like a foreign object, a jagged piece of a puzzle that had been forced into the wrong box. Looking at the frost-covered window, I didn't see my reflection. I saw a void where a daughter was supposed to be. Across the room, a family of 4 shared a single oversized slice of apple pie. They were dressed in worn parkas, their hands stained with the grit of honest, difficult labor, but they were laughing. The father leaned in to wipe a smudge of cinnamon from his daughter's cheek, and the sound of her giggle cut through the hum of the refrigerator like a knife. It hit me then, a physical ache in the center of my chest. We all pretend to be strong until the right pain finds us. I wasn't crying because I was weak. I was mourning the death of an illusion. My parents hadn't simply forgotten me in the holiday rush. Myra and Lyle had made a calculated, conscious decision to trade my presence for a convenient, drama-free peace. I stared at the scarred laminate table, thinking about the old American wisdom my grandmother used to whisper when the house was too loud with Eris's demands. A house is made of bricks, but a home is made of the people who don't ask you to earn your seat. I finally understood that the chair I had been fighting for in Greenwich was never mine to begin with. It was a prop, a placeholder for a daughter they wanted me to be, rather than the woman I actually was. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over me. I wasn't just an outlier in this diner. I was an outlier in my own bloodline. I hadn't noticed the man sitting in the booth directly across from mine until he signaled the waitress. He was dressed in a charcoal overcoat that cost more than most of the cars in the lot, his posture possessing a quiet, analytical precision. This was Vaughn. He wasn't staring at me with the patronizing pity I had come to expect from strangers. He was observing me with a steady, intellectual respect. He looked like the architecture he designed, composed, structured, and built to withstand a storm. Without a single word being exchanged, he caught the waitress's eye and gestured toward my empty table, indicating that a fresh pot of coffee should be sent my way. When the steaming mug was placed in front of me, I looked up, startled. Vaughn didn't smile. It wasn't the time for pleasantries. He simply gave a sharp, definitive nod. It was a gesture of human solidarity that felt heavier than any hug. For the first time in hours, the suffocating isolation began to lift. He stood up to leave, buttoning his coat with a practiced ease, but he paused at the edge of my booth. He reached for a plain paper napkin, uncapped a fountain pen, and wrote something with a swift, confident hand. He slid the napkin across the table, the paper dragging softly against the laminate. I looked down. On the napkin, the ink was still wet, forming words that felt like a decree. Blood is an accident. Family is a choice. Go build a table where no one has to beg for an invite. I looked from the paper back to Vaughn, my breath hitching in my throat. This was the moment of choice. Would I walk away from the toxicity, or would I keep playing the role of the victim just to survive in their orbit? Vaughn looked at me, his eyes dark and unwavering. You have the eyes of someone who is tired of being small, he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. Don't be. He turned and walked toward the door, the bell chiming as he stepped back into the freezing night. I sat there, my fingers tracing the indentations the pen had left on the napkin. I didn't chase him, but I gripped that piece of paper like a lifeline. I realized that the drama my mother, Myra, feared so much was actually just my own voice. A voice that was tired of being hushed for the sake of Eris's comfort. It was time to let that voice roar, but not in a house that didn't want to hear it. I would take that roar to a different city, a different life. I watched the family across the diner as they stood up to leave, the little girl clutching her father's hand. Before I left, I signaled the waitress and handed her a $100 bill. For the pie, I told her, nodding toward the family's empty booth. And tell them to keep laughing. It was a small act, but it felt like the first brick in the new house I was going to build. I wasn't going to respond to my family's cruelty with bitterness. I was going to respond by putting kindness back into a world that desperately needed it. I was reclaiming my own innate goodness, the part of me that Myra had tried to tell me was difficult. I pulled out my phone and checked my bank accounts. There it was, the college fund that Myra had emptied to pay for Eris's whims. I didn't feel the heat of rage this time. I felt a cold, legal clarity. Under Connecticut law, that money was a gift in trust, and what she had done was a breach of fiduciary duty. But I wouldn't sue them yet. I would let them believe I was broken. I would let them believe I was gone so I could grow in the shadows, unburdened by their expectations. I would become the architect of a life they couldn't even imagine. I opened my messaging app and typed a single, final text to Myra. You wanted no drama. You got it. From this moment on, I am a ghost in your story. I didn't wait for a reply. I blocked her number, then Lyle's, and then Eris's. I deleted every social media app, every digital breadcrumb that led back to the girl who had stood crying on a porch in Greenwich. I walked out of the diner, the freezing air no longer biting, but invigorating. I pulled out of the parking lot, the tires crunching on the fresh snow, and set my sights towards Chicago. I turned the steering wheel toward the interstate, leaving the ghost of Zana Thatcher in the rearview mirror as the first snowflakes of a 5-year silence began to cover my tracks. The wind in Chicago has a different temperament than the biting gales of Connecticut. Here it whistles through the canyons of steel and glass with a predatory intent, rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows of my high-rise studio. I stood against the glass, watching the sun dip below the jagged skyline, bleeding shades of bruised purple and burnt orange across Lake Michigan. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive vellum, and the sharp, clean aroma of drafting ink. My hands, once trembling with the uncertainty of a girl begging for a seat at the table, were now steady as they traced the intricate lines of a new architectural project. I was no longer a ghost haunting the hallways of Greenwich. I was Zana, the co-founder of an emerging agency, an architect building a life on the bedrock of my own resilience. The 5 years of silence hadn't been a void. They were a period of curing concrete, a slow, deliberate hardening of my spirit. I used to worry about the distance, fearing that every day without a phone call was a brick added to a wall I could never climb. Now I understood the necessity of that fortification. A building is only as strong as the ground it refuses to sink into, and I had finally stopped sinking. Working alongside Vaughn had transformed the way I viewed the world. He didn't just offer me a job. He offered me a mirror that reflected a woman of substance, a professional whose vision mattered. We spent our nights arguing over cantilevered edges and sustainable materials, creating a language of our own that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with merit. With the first significant bonus from our firm, I didn't buy jewelry or designer handbags. Instead, I established an anonymous scholarship fund for students coming from foster care or broken homes. True power isn't holding on to wealth. It's being the bridge you never had. I wanted to ensure that other young women wouldn't have to shrink themselves just to afford a future. In my professional life, I operated under my grandmother's maiden name, Morrison. It was a layer of digital armor, a way to move through the world without the Thatcher's shadow looming over my shoulder. In this hyper-connected age, to be invisible is to be invincible until the exact moment you choose to be seen. Everything was moving upward until the afternoon the software flagged a routine title search. We were looking into property acquisitions for a client when a familiar address in Connecticut blinked onto my screen. It was my grandmother's cottage, the salt-aired sanctuary where I spent my childhood summers. It was the only place where I had ever felt truly safe, a small piece of earth left specifically to me in a private trust. I felt a cold prickle of dread crawl down my spine as I clicked the Recent Transfers tab. The deed had been moved 3 months ago. The signatures at the bottom were unmistakable: Myra and Lyle Thatcher. I felt the air leave my lungs. My knuckles turned white against the edge of my desk as I pulled the public probate records. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was laid bare in clinical, legal font. My parents had petitioned the court to declare me whereabouts unknown, after 2 years of silence. They had used the very college fund they stole from me as evidence of my financial instability, claiming I had abandoned my assets and likely met an unfortunate end. They hadn't just sold the house. They had attempted to erase my legal existence so they could liquidate my inheritance. Vaughn walked into the office, the quiet click of his heels on the polished concrete snapping me back to the present. He saw my face, the way I was staring at the monitor with eyes that had turned into flint. He didn't ask if I was okay. He saw the deed on the screen and knew. He expected me to shatter, perhaps to finally let out the scream I'd been holding since that Thanksgiving porch. Instead, I stood up, my posture as rigid as a support beam. "They didn't just steal a house, Vaughn," I said, my voice barely a whisper but echoing with a terrifying clarity. "They tried to bury the owner so they could feast on the remains. They treated my grandmother's legacy like a communal ATM for Eris." It was a revelation of absolute greed. Eris had taken out a predatory bridge loan for a mansion she couldn't afford, and Myra, ever the enabler, had decided that my grandmother's salt-stained memories were a fair price to pay for Eris's comfort. They hadn't just excluded me, they had scavenged me. Vaughn reached for the phone, his face hardening into the strategic mask he wore in the boardroom. "I'll call the legal team," he said. "We can have a temporary restraining order on the sale proceeds by morning. We can freeze their accounts and bring a suit for fraud." I held up a hand, stopping him. The impulse for immediate war was there, hot and pulsing in my throat, but I forced it down. Under U.S. property law, a sale under a fraudulent missing person declaration is a massive felony, but an immediate lawsuit would warn them too early. They would scramble, hide assets, and retreat into their shells of good intentions. No, I wouldn't strike yet. I would let the debt accrue interest. I would let them sink deeper into the luxury they bought with my ghost. "Not yet," I said, looking out at the city lights. Eris's greed is a bottomless pit, and Myra will keep digging until the walls collapse on both of them. We won't strike for revenge. We will strike for the restoration of honor. I began a digital folder, dragging every forged document, every lie told to the probate court, and every suspicious bank transfer into an encrypted drive. Patience is the calm before the law, and I had learned to be very, very patient. Have you ever looked at the people who raised you and seen total strangers? There is a specific kind of grief that comes with realizing your parents don't just dislike you. They view you as an obstacle to their own desires. But forgiveness is for the soul. Boundaries are for the survival of the self. I wasn't going to let their betrayal define my day. I was going to let it fund my resolve. I closed the laptop with a definitive click and turned to Vaughn. He was watching me, his eyes filled with a new kind of admiration. He didn't see a victim. He saw a creditor who had finally decided it was time to collect. I looked down at the engagement ring he had given me weeks ago, the diamond catching the light from the street lamps below. I wasn't a girl lost in the snow anymore. I was a woman with a plan and a family that I had chosen with open eyes. I looked at Vaughn and smiled, a cold, certain expression that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with justice. "Let them enjoy the house for now," I said. "Every night they sleep there, every meal they eat in that kitchen, is another piece of evidence in the folder I'm building. They wanted a ghost? I'll give them one, until the day I decide to haunt them in a court of law." The snow began to settle over Chicago, a quiet white blanket that mirrored the silence I had maintained for 5 long years. But back in Connecticut, in a cottage that smelled of salt and betrayal, my family was sleeping in a bed made of lies. They were unaware that the daughter they had erased was currently holding the deed to their destruction. The morning light in Chicago didn't just illuminate my office. It acted as a spotlight on a transformation that felt surreal. Resting on my mahogany desk was the latest issue of Forbes, its high-gloss cover featuring my portrait under the headline, "The Silent Architect of Innovation." I looked at the sharp lines of my suit, the steady gaze in my eyes, and contrasted it with the image of the girl crying into a paper napkin 5 years ago. I was Zana Morrison now, at least in every way that mattered, and I had climbed out of the ruins of Connecticut to build a kingdom of my own. I understood that a tiger does not lose sleep over the opinion of sheep, but I also knew that the spotlight, while rewarding, often attracts the longest shadows. Back in Greenwich, the vultures had finally caught the scent of my success. Myra and Eris were drowning in the debt of their own making, the dream mansion becoming a tomb of unpaid invoices. When they saw that magazine, they didn't feel a flicker of pride. They felt a surge of predatory entitlement. My mother, Myra, didn't see a daughter who had survived her cruelty. She saw a family asset that had dared to appreciate in value without her permission. She hired a cut-rate private investigator to pierce the veil of my 5-year silence, hunting for an address, a weakness, or a way back into my bank account. Vaughn warned me that the perimeter was being tested, but I remained stoic. They didn't want the girl in the rain, and they certainly wouldn't get the woman in the sun. I decided to let them show their hands first. The confrontation came on a Tuesday. I was reviewing design proofs when my assistant buzzed through, her voice tinged with hesitation. A woman claiming to be my mother was in the lobby. Myra didn't burst in with rage. She entered with a calculated, fragile grace. She was wearing a muted headscarf and looked 10 years older, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She collapsed into the chair opposite me, her voice a trembling whisper as she spoke of stage 4 cancer and a desperate need for $5 million to fund an experimental treatment in Switzerland. She pleaded for one last act of daughterly love, a performance so polished it almost felt like the truth. I sat across from her, my face a mask of professional detachment, though a pang of genuine empathy stirred deep within me. It wasn't for Myra, but for the universal concept of a mother, the one I had never truly had. No one should have to face the end alone, but my intelligence had been forged in the fires of her previous deceptions. I didn't reach for my checkbook. Instead, I leaned forward and spoke in a voice that was both gentle and firm. I told her that I wouldn't let her suffer, but that before we moved a single cent, I would have my private medical consultant provide a second opinion and a direct transfer to the clinic. We drove to a top-tier clinic in the city, the silence in the car heavy with the weight of 5 years of unsaid things. My associate, a leading oncologist, took Myra back for a pre-treatment scan. I stood in the sterile white hallway, the smell of antiseptic filling my lungs, waiting for the final verdict. When the doctor emerged, he didn't need to speak. One look at his face told me everything. There was no cancer. There was no illness. Myra's frailty was a costume made of clever makeup and a soul that had no floor. The moment the doctor left, Myra dropped the mask. Her posture straightened, her eyes losing their misty sorrow and sharpening into shards of ice. She didn't offer an apology. She offered an ultimatum. "You owe me this money, Zana," she spat, her voice venomous as it echoed off the white walls. "I wasted 27 years of my life raising an ungrateful brat like you. Give me the 5 million, or I will turn your upcoming wedding into a funeral for your reputation. I'll tell every magazine in this country that you let your dying mother rot in the streets while you played at being a mogul." I stood there, watching the woman who had given me life attempt to trade it for a payday. I realized then that some people are spiritually terminal, consumed by a sickness of the heart that no amount of money can cure. I reached into my pocket and turned off the recording app on my phone. I had the entire threat, the confession of the hoax, the extortion, the malice. But I didn't call the police. I understood that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing a thief back into your house. It means acknowledging they are a thief and locking the door for good. I looked at her, and for the first time I felt nothing but a quiet, profound mercy. "You taught me that drama is a choice, Myra," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And this is my choice. I will not give you $5 million, but I have just authorized a $5 million donation to the National Cancer Research Foundation in your name. I've already sent the receipt to your email." It was an act of extreme grace that doubled as a legal fortress. I had supported her medical cause in a way she could never touch, leaving her with a tax write-off she didn't need and a legacy she didn't deserve. "You're a monster!" she hissed, her face contorting with a rage that finally matched her soul. I didn't flinch. I signaled the 2 security guards waiting at the end of the hall. I told her that the donation was final, and that any further contact would result in the release of our recorded conversation to the authorities and the very magazines she threatened to call. "You are spiritually terminal, Myra," I said as she was led away. "And I refuse to be your cure." I returned to my office, the glass-walled silence feeling like a sanctuary. I sat at my desk and watched the security footage on my monitor as Myra was escorted through the lobby, her mouth moving in silent, futile curses. My phone buzzed on the mahogany surface, a save-the-date notification for our upcoming housewarming party. I looked at Vaughn, who had been watching from the doorway, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor. "Invite them," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Invite Myra, Lyle, and Eris. Let's give them the stage they're so desperate for. It's time to end the play." I stood in the silence of my office, holding the receipt for a donation they could never touch, knowing that the vultures were no longer just circling. They were finally invited to the feast of their own undoing. The glass-walled silence of my office had been a sanctuary for years, but tonight, the battlefield shifted to my own living room. My penthouse in Chicago is a masterpiece of light and discipline, overlooking the restless, dark expanse of Lake Michigan. On this Friday evening, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying thrum of sophisticated jazz. The elite of the city's design and business worlds mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their voices a polite murmur of admiration. I moved through the crowd with a calculated poise, my silk dress trailing softly against the marble. A stark contrast to Myra and Eris, who stood near the buffet like predators wearing borrowed finery. They looked at the mahogany and the art not with appreciation, but with a naked, shivering greed. I greeted my biological parents with the same practiced kindness I would show any distant acquaintance. I ensured their glasses were never empty of the finest vintage, and that they were offered the most delicate hors d'oeuvres. I've always believed that charity starts at home, but dignity begins with a closed door. I wasn't being weak by inviting them. I was being a host, showing them the breathtaking height of the world they had so casually thrown away 5 years ago. I wanted them to feel the weight of every choice they had made. As the night progressed, I strategically mentioned a private legal matter needing my attention in the office, making sure Myra heard me. On my desk, I had left a folder labeled in bold, undeniable text, "Final Will and Testament Sole Heir, Heiress Thatcher." It was a simple test of character to see if they would celebrate my life or try to steal my future. While the gala roared in the main ballroom, I retreated to a concealed monitor in the kitchen. I watched as Eris slipped away from the party, her face a mask of bitter envy fueled by debt. She entered my private office, her eyes immediately locking onto the folder. She didn't just read it. I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She realized she didn't want to wait for me to pass away to claim what she felt she was owed. In a fit of petty, unbridled rage, she decided that if she couldn't inhabit my life, she would dismantle it. She pulled a silver flask of wine from her clutch, her hands trembling with a malice that made my stomach turn. She stepped toward my primary server rack, the digital brain of my billion-dollar agency, and prepared to pour the liquid into the cooling vents. The music in the ballroom suddenly died. A massive projector screen, intended for a housewarming tribute, lowered from the ceiling. The celebratory video was replaced by a high-definition, live-streamed feed from my office security cameras. 100 guests, my peers, my mentors, and my competitors, watched in a deafening, suffocating silence. We saw Eris tilt the flask. We saw the look of pure, destructive intent on her face. I stepped to the front of the room, the microphone in my hand feeling heavy and cold. "I wanted to see if you loved me more than my money," I whispered into the quiet air. "You didn't even wait for the dessert to try and burn my house down, Eris." The exposure was absolute. Guests began to whisper, the socialite mask Eris had carefully maintained for years shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Myra didn't rush to apologize or to stop her daughter. She rushed toward me, her face flushed with a feral desperation. She screamed that I had set them up, that I was a monster for baiting her fragile daughter. I stood my ground, my expression as unshakable as the glass walls surrounding us. A trap only works on those who are looking for a way to steal. I didn't create her greed, I simply provided a mirror for it. Looking at them now, I understood a hard truth. Some people don't want to build a house, they just want to make sure you're homeless. The drama they had accused Zana of 5 years ago was nothing more than their own reflection, a projection of the chaos they carried within themselves. I didn't have the police remove them immediately. I allowed the weight of the social execution to sink in. My peers watched as the perfect Thatcher family was revealed as a collection of scavengers. I signaled my security team to escort them not to the elevator, but to a private side room. I had one more card to play, one that required the cold, clinical precision of the law rather than the heat of a public scandal. As the guests began to filter out, their gossip filling the hallways, Myra turned to me one last time. Her eyes were wild, her voice a hissed promise of further war. "You think a video is enough? I have something that will strip you of every cent you've made, daughter." I watched the security feed loop on the wall, seeing my sister's face distorted by greed, realizing that the final bridge hadn't just been burned, it had been detonated by the very people who claimed to build it. I stood in the wreckage of their lies, feeling the weight of the Morrison name like a shield, knowing that the sun was about to rise on a life where the word family finally meant home. The glittering guests had mostly vanished, leaving behind only the cold hum of the air conditioning and the sharp, bitter scent of the wine Eris had spilled in her desperate attempt at sabotage. But as I looked at Myra, I realized the night wasn't over. Faced with the public shame of the security footage, my mother didn't retreat. She pivoted. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope, her face twisting into a mask of aggressive, desperate authority. "This little show doesn't change the truth, Zana," Myra shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the penthouse. She turned to the remaining staff and my few close associates, waving the papers like a weapon. "My daughter is not a success. She is mentally unstable. This whole evening is the product of a psychotic break. I have the records to prove it. She began to distribute copies of forged psychiatric documents claiming I had suffered a chronic paranoid episode 5 years ago. Under the guise of protection, Myra announced that she had already filed for an emergency temporary conservatorship in Connecticut. She intended to freeze my multi-million-dollar business accounts immediately. I didn't scream. I stood perfectly still, watching her describe me as a broken child to the very people who had just seen me honored on the cover of Forbes. I felt a profound, heavy clarity. Some people don't want to heal your wounds. They want to own the scars so they can charge you for the bandages. I looked at the dates on her official diagnosis. They matched the exact week I was actually in Chicago, signing the lease on my first design studio. I didn't fight her. I simply watched the trap being sprung on the trapper. Have you ever noticed how the people who try to call you crazy are usually just terrified of your clarity? The tension was suffocating until Alara Morrison stepped forward. Vaughn reached for my hand, but it was his mother who took the floor. With her silver hair catching the light and a gaze that had silenced courtrooms for decades, she looked at Myra with a chilling, clinical calm. "Mrs. Thatcher," Alara said, her voice a low, resonant bell that commanded the room. "I spent 25 years as a superior court judge. I've seen thousands of desperate people, but I've never seen a forgery quite as clumsy as this one." Alara produced a counterfile from her own bag, a dossier she had been building since the day she met me. She laid out the cold, hard evidence of the missing persons scam. She showed the bank records of the grandmother's cottage sale, and the forged signatures Lyle and Myra had submitted to the probate court. Under 18 U.S. Code Section 1341, Alara continued, her tone dropping into a judicial hammer, mail and wire fraud in probate cases carries up to 20 years in federal prison. You didn't file for guardianship because you cared about Zana. You filed because you're bankrupt and looking for a host to bleed dry. The room went silent as the legal reality of Alara's words settled. I looked at Myra, then at Lyle, who looked like he was about to collapse. "I spent 27 years trying to be enough for you," I said, my voice gentle but as firm as a support beam. "I realize now that you didn't need a daughter. You needed a scapegoat. I forgive the girl you tried to kill, but I will protect the woman I've become. Myra, your power over me didn't end when I left Connecticut. It ended the moment I realized you never loved me at all." Lyle finally spoke, but it wasn't to defend me, or even Myra. "Prison?" he whispered, his voice cracking with the cowardice that had defined my entire childhood. "Zana, please, we can talk about this." I looked at my biological father and felt nothing but a distant, hollow pity. Silence in the face of injustice isn't peace, it's permission. He had given them permission to erase me for 3 decades, and now he was asking for a seat at a table he had helped to burn. Eris tried to scream, to make one last scene, but I cut her off with a look that was colder than the Chicago winter. "The law is no longer a tool you can use against me," I told them. "It is the wall I have built between us. The police are downstairs waiting to take a statement regarding the digital sabotage and these fraudulent medical records. You wanted no drama? This is the final act." I realized that gratefulness is a gift, but it shouldn't be a ransom. I didn't owe them my life just because they were present at the start of it. I signaled for the security guards to move them to the final room for the legal closing. I watched them walk away, their shoulders slumped, their empire of lies finally crumbling under the weight of the truth. It was a strange feeling, not of triumph, but of a long overdue release. To those of you watching, remember, you don't have to carry the people who refuse to see you. Sometimes, walking away is the only way to find where you truly belong. Alara placed her hand on my shoulder, her touch firm yet maternal. "There's one more document to sign tonight, Zana," she whispered. "It will formalize everything." I looked at Vaughn, and I saw a future where I no longer had to worry about looking around. I closed the door on the past, not with a bang of anger, but with the soft click of a lock, knowing that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just staying somewhere. I was home. 2 weeks had passed since the glass in my penthouse held the reflection of a family falling apart. Now, the Chicago sun poured through the tall windows of the Morrison Estate Library, warming the spines of old books and the polished surface of a heavy walnut desk. I sat in the center of that golden light, a fountain pen balanced in my hand. Before me lay the Illinois adult adoption petition. In this country, we are often told that family is a fixed point, an unchangeable map drawn at birth. But as I looked at the clinical black and white lines of the document, I knew better. An adult adoption doesn't just change a name, it issues a new birth certificate. It creates a legal next of kin status that no blood relative can ever contest. It is the ultimate architecture of choice. The philosophy of my identity had shifted. We are all born into a story we didn't write, but we have the absolute right to edit the ending. Myra and Lyle were biology. This paper was my destiny. I ran my thumb over the signature line, feeling the texture of the paper. I had chosen to keep my grandmother's middle name, Grace. It was a tribute to the only kindness I knew during those hollow years in Greenwich. Honoring the past doesn't mean staying a prisoner to it. It means carrying the light and leaving the shadows behind. I reviewed the finality of the document with a sharp, professional eye. By signing this, I was legally severing the Thatcher name. I was ensuring that if I ever faced a medical crisis or a legal hurdle, the people standing by my bed would be the ones who actually loved me. The power of familial necessity was being stripped from the predators and handed to the protectors. The final threshold required one last walk through the fire. A few days later, I stood in a neutral gray boardroom downtown. Myra and Lyle sat across from me, flanked by lawyers who looked exhausted by their clients' delusions. They were desperate. The federal fraud charges and the evidence of the missing persons scam had left them with no moves. They tried to offer a settlement. They actually suggested they would forgive me for my supposed drama if I simply paid off their debts and allowed them to keep the grandmother's cottage. I looked at Myra, noticing how small she seemed without her mask of maternal authority. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply slid the signed adoption decree across the table. "I didn't replace you," I said, my voice as steady as the skyscrapers outside the window. "I simply found the family that you refused to be. You asked for no drama for 5 years. This is the ultimate silence." Myra's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the paper, at the name Zana Morrison, and finally understood that I was legally a stranger to her. However, I wasn't there for revenge. Instead of pursuing the maximum prison sentence for their probate fraud, I had agreed to a plea deal. It required them to perform extensive community service at a shelter for displaced and runaway youth. I wanted them to see the children who were actually alone. Perhaps then they might finally understand the value of the daughter they threw away. I stood up, adjusting my coat. Lyle looked up at me, his eyes wet with a regret that came far too late. "Zana, please," he whispered. I looked at him and felt a strange, quiet mercy. "Boundaries are not a lack of love, Lyle," I told him. "They are the presence of self-respect." I left the room without looking back. My footsteps were light and certain on the marble floors. I was no longer carrying the weight of people who refused to carry me. When I returned to the house, the table was already set. Vaughn was in the kitchen, the scent of roasting herbs and good wine filling the air. Ilara and Alistair were there, their presence a solid, warm pillar in my new life. There was no drama here. No one was monitoring my triggers or asking me to shrink so someone else could feel big. There was only the quiet clinking of wine glasses and the laughter of people who actually knew me. I looked at the table and realized that I had spent 27 years trying to earn a seat that was never meant for me. To those of you who have spent your lives waiting for an invite from people who refuse to see you, stop. Don't waste another breath begging for a place at a table that leaves you hungry. Go build your own. I looked at the empty chair at the end of our table. It wasn't a sign of someone missing. It was an invitation for a future I had finally chosen for myself. The greatest revenge isn't to hurt those who hurt you. It is to be so happy that they no longer matter. Vaughn pulled out my chair, his hand lingering on my shoulder for a moment. I sat down, the Morrison name now a permanent part of my soul. The camera of my life seemed to zoom out then, capturing the golden glow of the room and the faces of my chosen family. The adoption decree sat on the library desk, the ink dry and unshakable. I was no longer a ghost. I was home.